Mostly what I'm going to do in order to instantiate this keyword is actually tell a story. But I wanted to, before I do that, to say a few words about why it is I would choose estrangement as a term, particularly in my assigned role as the meta-narrator. I think that it's largely because I see the positionality of the narrator as a narrative as one that's best described by estrangement. A narrator is a narrative immanent subject. It is the subjectivity immanent to narrative, and with which it engages a very paradoxical and kind of circular role, because of course the narrative emerges from the narrator, who emerges from the narrative. So the narrator in that respect is always in excess to the narrative which he or she pushes forward. So the narrator is the vehicle of a narrative, but is in excess of it. So is always strange, is always an extra, an excessive, a surplus element to it. And yet the paradox of that, and we see it in the history of narrative throughout the Western tradition, right from, let's say, from the lyrical narratives of Mr. Homer, right, all the way to basically the collapse of that whole tradition in the works of, let's say, Samuel Beckett. The presence, the excessive presence of the narrator does nothing to diminish the power of the narrative itself. The narrators of Beckett are constantly foregrounding their own narratorship, making it's just a narrative, and at the same time, in no way, that's the whole paradox, which is the motor behind, or the engine behind Beckett's greatest work, which was the trilogy. This constant attempt, the narrators killing each other off one after the other in an attempt to get somehow behind the historicization, behind the storytelling, the narrativization. But being unable to do that. But the effect, I guess, of having a narrator in excess of a narrative is that narrative is rendered somehow, or is denaturalized. It becomes inhabitual. We can look at it from a distance and from a variety of different angles. From a kind of perspectivism which is built into that excessive narratorial position. Which is exactly why, and this is where I get the word estrangement, the translation of it anyways, is why Wright championed it to such an extent in his sort of heroic combat against the Aristotelian aesthetics of theater, and all the cathartic identification that goes with that idea of representation, which was born around tragedy. That symbolic killing, that symbolic tyrannicide, the symbolic killing of the king, which displaced the previous carnivalesque Dionysian festivals in Athens with a more controlled form of representation. And so Brecht was very much opposed to that because he wanted people, rather than to feel catharsis through an identification with what was happening, the story being told, would of course be in a position to, after leaving the theater, to do something about it. In other words, much more based on a kind of theater praxis. And so Brecht, in the Brechtian school of acting, right, is that he would ask his actors not only to incarnate a role, I mean everyone knows this, but I'm just repeating it for the sake of estrangement, but also somehow to step outside of that role and to narrate it. So it was a kind of narrative acting technique, asking the person to at once speak in the first person and somehow inflect it with the third person. A bit like what Gilles Deleuze once called the fourth person singular. So that leads me to and of course there's many different ways of engaging with estrangement, but let's leave it at that for now. This leads me to another point about the type of historicization, or the type of storytelling, like what would be a kind of Aristotelian storytelling in our domain, as opposed to a more Brechtian variant. Well, I think that art historians, and I think particularly left-leaning art historians have accustomed us to, not only within art, but let's say, we'll just stick to that for now, social historians as well, have accustomed us to think of art in terms of a series of events. Exhibitions are events, publications are events, performances are events. And art itself is seen as a kind of incarnation of eventhood. So that the limelight of the attention economy is once again being test-driven within the realm of art, rather than being critiqued. But the problem with this type of storytelling, event-based, that is Aristotelian variety, as opposed to the more estrangement embodied variety, would be that ultimately you can never account for why there are events in the first place. The stuff of storytelling is the usual, the everyday, the stuff that goes on, the kind of the bubbling away that goes on beneath the volcano, rather than that more eruptive moment when it goes off. And I choose that image not entirely by chance, because I think that actually the event-based historiography or historicization is very much has a masculine bias to it. It's very much an ejaculatory image of a historical process. And of course, I have nothing against the ejaculation, but I think that it would be foolish to base a theory of desire upon it, just as I think it would be foolish to base a theory of historicization of art on the notion of eventhood, rather than looking at the notion of what's going on in the shadows that are cast by this very brilliant and very almost dazzling attention economy. So now I want to tell a story to try and to draw that out. Maybe it's a story that you know. It's the story of an Estonian-American conceptualist called Raivo Pusant. Raivo Pusant, that's P-W-U-U-S-E-N-P. Everybody know the story of Raivo? Well, that's good. I mean, I kind of thought you did, but what's interesting, the reason I wasn't going to tell this story, I was going to tell a totally different one that makes contemporary art or its history, its historicization, as strange as it ought to be, as it was when it was being developed, as much as it is in hindsight, as it was for those who were kind of shambling to put it together. But this is a different story, and it touches, I think, on just about all of the words that were teased out yesterday in the course of the presentation. So that's why I picked this one. Raivo Pusant's this guy who went to art school in the late 1950s in Salt Lake City, in Utah, where he met his lifelong best friend, Paul McCarthy. And, you know, they like to hang out together and rock climb and go skiing and stuff. But after art school, they figure, okay, this is not going to go anywhere. We're never going to be artists who hang around Salt Lake City, right, with the Mormons. So McCarthy decides to go to Los Angeles, and Pusant goes to New York. Pusant goes to New York, and he joins up with this, we're now in the early 1960s, early mid-60s. Pusant joins up with this absolutely fascinating art collective called Museum, if you can believe that. And, but they don't actually work in a museum at all, despite their name. They actually managed to get themselves a metro station, a disused metro station somewhere in Upper Manhattan. Huge space where they were able to experiment with different things. But what Pusant took away from that experience was basically he learned a lot about what it was to work with other people, like how collectively initiated projects would function and so on. It was a key experience for what would follow. But the real thing that Pusant was doing in those days was that he was having unbelievably quick success within the art world. Like, we've all met these kinds of artists. He just was one of these guys who could do no wrong. He would just, he'd meet a dealer, the size of the guy, say, you want a show? And in 5 minutes, he'd come up with something that would work, that would gain recognition, and he would find himself sort of immediately being boosted within the reputational economy of the art world of those days. Okay? But then, I won't go into the works that he was doing, but it's just, I will say this though, in those same years, in a totally different field, Pierre Bourdieu was working on what he calls his actor field theory, by which he describes how it is that actors within a field just sort of know what to do. In other words, they have a horizon of expectations against which they know beyond which they know their discourse will become impossible and their actions will not be receivable. but short of which they won't attain any recognition either. It's a bit like high-level athletes, for example, always know in the absolutely original configuration of the game exactly where you have to be at the right moment for the play. Right? Hockey, or no matter how fast-paced it is, a really good player knows how to do it. And Bourdieu makes that analogy to kind of pre-reflexive knowledge. And I think as experts in the art field, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Like you know that beyond a certain level, you might want to go there, but you know that it's not going to fly. Or you're afraid that it won't fly. And then someone else will have a little bit of pizzazz and they'll break their face. And somebody else will have a bit of pizzazz and they'll get away with it. But this is how the field is played out. And if you, by analogy, I think it's something like that Wright, Poussin, and many other artists, but not that many other artists, would explain that kind of pre-reflexive understanding of the art field at that time. But I mention it because, of course, what most of the time Poussin was doing was hanging out with his buddies drinking beer. And his buddies, of course, didn't have the same kind of fluency and the same kind of facile success within the art world that he was enjoying, right? So, you know, you've been to these kinds of meetings, right? These guys would be sitting around drinking beer, they'd be griping about the art world. You know, it's like how unfair it is, how corrupt it is, cronyism. It's not, you know, it's all about who you know and not what you do. This sort of frustration. And he would like feel completely estranged in a certain respect because he's going, no, dude, just do it. I mean, so he began to think about this, and then this is the first point I want to make, is that he developed, I think, which is for me, one of the most interesting shadow practices that I know, is that he developed a practice which he referred to as idea seeding, or concept planting. So he said, well, for example, when he'd get involved in these kinds of conversations, which are absolutely inevitable amongst wannabe artists, is that he would float an idea. Like he wouldn't say, okay, this is what you've got to do, okay, just do this and it'll work, okay? He would just sort of put it out there. He would seed it, basically, in the field. He planted it. And then he would consider that if, in the course of that conversation, right, that idea was taken up and was executed successfully, and that the person who executed it obtained the kind of art world acknowledgement that they were looking for, then he would consider that his work was completed. So it's a kind of discursive ecology, right? It's about planting, about seeding, and not really about harvesting. Because you don't reap the benefits of that harvest in that sense. So it's a very interesting idea. He says it didn't very often work, but he said it did work on about 4, 5, or maybe 6 occasions over the 2-year period. Okay, so just a quick moment of narratorial reflection about that part of the story. Right? That whole idea is kind of premise, isn't it, on a notion not of ownership of ideas, but of their usership. Basically, that you don't own ideas. I mean, you might want to think in the art world that you own the idea, and you might want to do the exhibition and the book and get that stuff out there, make the event before somebody else does. But, you know, that's so vain and futile in a certain way. I think that's what Poussin saw, that it's just so much more interesting to, if you want to have your ideas advance in the field, then the more people that are advancing them, the better it's going to be, right? So he would plant them and accept that in a conversation, nobody owns the words, that they just sort of floating around out there. So I think that, I've been thinking for a while now that idea seeding is one of the most interesting ways, and it's kind of linked, I think, to your critique of humanism, because it's kind of a subjectless form of some form of action. There's definitely a sense of modesty and even of extreme resignation in this sort of idea, of considering that the seeding itself is more important than the harvest. But the story doesn't end there, because after about 2 years of doing this, and maybe even less, I know that after 2 years he radically stopped. Because why? Because he said, yeah, but these guys are my friends. These are my drinking buddies. And there's something really manipulative about this, right? Is that when maybe they're happy that they get the success, but I can never say, hey, yeah, but you know what, that was my idea, right? Because that would one, they would think I was just, like we've all met people like that, right? Or even they sort of know where the idea did come. They know whose idea they're using, but it would make the whole thing falsified. But there's something still manipulative because there's a disparity in terms of consciousness, in terms of what I know about what they know or about what they think I know that they don't know, and so on. So he goes, well, they're my friends, I can't continue this manipulation, I've got to stop. And then he asks himself, but is there some avenue of human endeavor where manipulation is acceptable, where it's not only tolerable, but in fact necessary? And dude, there is. Politics. Because politics, as Poussin theorized it at that time, is not about this kind of spontaneous knowledge of the people, that all of a sudden they think, hey, let's get rid of Ben Ali. Oh yeah, let's do it. It's obviously something which is prepared a long time in advance. It's seeded, it's planted, it's conditioned, watered, nourished, and then maybe it will bear some fruit. So we're in 1975 at this point. Poussin's living in a place in upstate New York called Rosendale, not far from the Canadian border. Now, 1975 in the United States, I mean, the place is in shambles, right? The country is absolutely pitted against itself. You have to remember that the vice president is in jail. Nixon is about to resign to avoid going to jail. I mean, it's really like House of Cards, right? Where the Speaker of the Senate becomes president just because the rest of them all are... So, America's pitted against itself. It hasn't even pulled out of Vietnam yet. You've got on the one hand the rednecks and on the other hand the hippies. And this scenario is absolutely replicated in the village of Rosendale where he lives. The city, or it's a village actually, the township of Rosendale is not just any old place either in New England, because it's one of the original townships that was settled with the first wave of European settlers. And so the predicament that the town finds itself in is overdetermined by that fact. The situation is that the town is absolutely mired in debt. The police is totally corrupt. The sewers are flowing over. The water system doesn't work. The roads are pitted with potholes. Nothing's working. And the only solution that everybody knows is the one that nobody can articulate. It's one of those public secrets, is that it has to be amalgamated with the municipality next to it of the same name. In other words, its limits have to be redrawn. This is really about redrawing the picture, the map of the township. But you can't say that, and you can all the less say it if you're an Estonian called Poussin in this town that's like controlled by an extremely sort of, not really blue-blooded, but in any case, a long lineage of European Americans. So Poussin decides that, well, he can't actually say that, so he decides that he will run in the municipal election. But he'll run on a very upbeat campaign to positively address the problems that exist within that town. A very pragmatic campaign. And he will not say anything about the fact that for him this is a fully fledged collective and conceptual art project. In fact, he never tells anyone, or almost, about this. He doesn't tell his wife. He can't tell anyone because if he did, of course, they would feel that they were being manipulated. But in fact, what he was doing was he was synthesizing his experience of idea seeding with his experience with the museum group that he worked with, and testing it out on the one-to-one scale, testing it out, ramping up an art project to the full scale of municipal politics. The only person he really did tell about it was McCarthy, who was totally freaked out by the whole thing and thought it was a paradigm or the sort of an emblem of artistic irresponsibility. But in any case, it works out extremely well because he addresses, first of all, police corruption, then the sewer problems, then the road problems, the water problems, and so on. And at a certain point, having gained some credibility, but not having gone through like a hailstorm of a maelstrom of attacks and debates and town hall discussions and so on, he gets to the point where he has enough credibility to put on the table the idea of the dissolution of Rosendale. The dissolution and the amalgamation with the township next door. He puts it on the table. There's a referendum which is held. An overwhelming majority, over 70% of the inhabitants of the town, vote in favor of his proposition. The next day, he resigns as mayor of Rosendale and leaves New York forever and returns to Utah, withdrawing completely from that attention economy and rejoining, I would say, that sort of nebula of what I call, or might call, off-road conceptualists who continue doing stuff but who never necessarily perform what they do as art. I'm going to end right now. Just I want to draw, if I may, one or two, or maybe even 2.5, not conclusions, but maybe some points from that story. One, of course, is the question of estrangement itself, because how different and yet how absolutely identical is telling the story than having lived it. Nothing could be more similar, and yet nothing could be more different in a certain respect. The coefficient of art somehow completely shifts. And in this way, I mean, it's reminiscent of some of the discussions which we had yesterday. It's reminiscent of what happens when narratorship is injected into a mix with something whose self-understanding may be grounded in art, but whose specific visibility, to riff off a term of Donald Judd, not a specific object, but specific visibility, is very much grounded in art. So I think that impacts on a number of the decisions, or the discussions which we had yesterday about keeping this kind of potentiality open, and I'll just leave it that way.